Let me come to your lecture. I was supposed and asked to speak about one aspect of my last book, namely a more normative understanding of the market. And so I started again, and I was rethinking a little bit what I had done in my book, Freedom's Right, and the result is the lecture I will now present. Ever since the free market was established as the main form of coordinating economic activities in Western societies, roughly around the end of the 18th century, it has been interpreted in the most diverse ways, with each interpretation focusing on a different feature of the market. Even the enigmatic concept Homo economicus, which stems from the end of the Middle Ages in England, expresses just how varied the reactions, both positive and negative, to the rapidly expanding market system has always been, even at the beginning of capitalist industrialization. On the one hand, the development of this new model of human being, Homo economicus, which solely pursues her own individual preferences, was regarded as a long sought-after liberation from feudal and aristocratic dependencies. On the other side, the notion that economic activity is dominated by the aim of maximizing private utility was viewed as a threat to social bonds and life-world commitments. If we step back from these historical debates about the shape and substance of Homo economicus, a debate in which even such prominent German thinkers as Schiller, Schleiermacher, and Hegel were involved, we will find three typical responses to the new system of the market economy, all of which continue to be relevant today. The first and now classic interpretation justifies the market as a means of improving economic efficiency, as it compels self-interested actors to exchange their goods solely by means of supply and demand, and by that increasing social welfare. The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith seems to claim that when each individual strictly follows his own individual preferences, maximizing his utility by exchanging with others on a completely free market, the well-being of all members of society will improve as if steered by an invisible hand, his famous formulation. This conception of the market as an institution in which entirely self-interested actors encounter each other in the pursuit of their own benefit contradicts a second early interpretation of the market, one which focuses on the ethics that both precede and accompany this new economic system. According to this view, the market must be ethically embedded if it is to function effectively at all. Competition on the market must be either attenuated or restricted by moral orientations other than the pure striving for greater efficiency. Adam Smith could even be counted among the authors who propose such an interpretation of the market. After all, he is also the author of the theory of moral sentiments, in which he sought to describe the moral attitudes of mutual benevolence that are crucial to civil coexistence. A third interpretation of the market should be familiar to everybody. In the wake of the international financial crisis, it has once again come to the forefront and reflects a diffuse mood among the general public. According to this interpretation, the third one, which goes back to the works of early socialists and finds its intellectual climax in the writings of Karl Marx, the market economy is incapable of making good on its promises to improve general well-being and expand individual freedoms. This theory claims that regardless of whether the market is entirely free or ethically restricted, it subjects the lives and working conditions of the greater part of society to the investment decisions of the companies that dominate the market, thus refuting any notion of a general increase of freedom and well-being. For reasons that hopefully will become clear, I will only be dealing with the first two of these three interpretations of the market in the beginning, and then come back to the last, the Marxist interpretation. I will begin by presenting a step-by-step critique of the first interpretation, the one upheld by the dominant economic theory, by showing that the market has in fact always been subject to ethical restrictions. I therefore hope to be able to show that we can only get an adequate sense of the current problems with the market economy by gaining a sufficient awareness of such restrictions as well as of the permanent dispute over them. So let me start. As is well known, modern economics base their economic models on the classical view of the market, according to which the market is inhabited by actors who seek to maximize their utility in the pursuit of their individual preferences. By reducing all economic activity to the pursuit of pure egocentric utility, neoclassical economics enabled itself to a certain degree to provide mathematical models for how the market functions, which could give the impression that this social science could in fact match the objectivity and prognostic capacity of the natural sciences. However, it has always been a matter of dispute whether this theory's basic assumption about human behavior represent descriptive or normative premises. That is, whether the idea that humans seek to maximize their utility is to be regarded as an empirical finding or merely as a normative proposal. If we regard the basic assumptions of neoclassical economics as a set of empirical statements, then we would have to see them as highly doubtful. As early as the 19th century, anthropologists, sociologists, and psychologists have shown just how implausible it is to assume that people always seek to maximize their utility. Moral considerations and ethical convictions are a constant factor in deciding how we act. This conveys the fact that there are certain things humans appreciate for their own sake and not for their own utility, and that they do not view each other as mere competitors over scarce resources, but instead feel obligated to show each other a certain degree of respect or recognition. An awareness of this fact has even begun to take hold in economic theory itself. For instance, behavioral economics studies the role of considerations of fairness and justice on market behavior. It seems just as implausible to view the basic assumptions of economic theory as being mere normative suggestions. This would mean that economists had conceded both to themselves and to their audience that they ascribe a kind of educational or socializing role to the market, which would eventually abolish all ethical attitudes not aimed at maximizing utility as mere historical leftovers. The dominant economic theory in which the first interpretation of the market finds its clearest expression has been faced from the very beginning with a theoretical dilemma. Either its assumption of self-interested utility maximizers is to be understood as an empirical thesis, which would make the theory guilty of making a highly unrealistic and improbable claim, or this premise is to be understood as a normative proposal, which would mean risking its reputation as an objective science and revealing itself to have a merely educational, even probably ideological authority. This weakness of the prevalent economic theory has been exploited by the second interpretation of the market. According to this interpretation, normative orientations are not merely occasionally practiced, by economic actors, but are instead constitutive for the successful functioning of the market as a whole. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and Emil Durkheim, alongside Adam Smith, are primary representatives of this view. And more recently, sociologists such as Albert Hirschman have made similar claims. The basic thesis of these authors, who all share a common tradition of moral economism, is always the same. Market actors cannot be understood merely as individual utility maximizers, if indeed their individual intentions are to be coordinated successfully by the invisible hand. Instead, they must always recognize the fact that they depend on each other and owe each other a measure of moral consideration. Such orientations, which are not economic in the strict sense of the term, can derive from very different normative sources, expressing either traditional conceptions of the common good, modern conceptions of social justice, or emotionally based attitudes of benevolence. On the second interpretation of the market, what matters is not the origin of the presupposed and accompanying ethical orientations, but the fact that, taken together, they form an indispensable condition for the market's coordination of individual intentions, which enables it to contribute invisibly to a general increase in well-being and freedom. In order to gain an initial sense of how normative orientations influence market activities, we should not adopt a proposal made by the economic sociologist Jens Beckert from Germany. In a recent essay, he distinguishes between three different forms of ethical attitudes in the economic context of modern societies, according to their respective consequences for the functioning of the market. By proceeding in this manner, Beckert believes we can make clear distinctions between an ethics that enables the market, one that accompanies the market, and one that restricts the market. And I will follow this distinction between three ways in which ethics relate to the market in the following and in my in the reflections which will follow now. So I will comment on market enabling ethics, on the ethics accompanying the market, and then on ethics restricting the market. And I think all three relations are of equal importance. So let me come to the market enabling ethics. Sociologists and historians have long been aware that interest-based market relationships owe their existence and development to normative orientations that go beyond the pursuit of mere self-interest. Emil Durkheim has developed the most systematic account of the ethical foundations of the market, showing that all contracts necessarily rely upon the non-contractual precondition of moral consent, for the parties to the contract must mutually recognize and trust each other to respect the terms of the contract, even when it is no longer in their interest to do so. Therefore, every purely strategic relationship maintained by utility maximizers on the market depends on an antedecent morality of a certain kind of recognition. This enables contracting parties to mutually respect each other as responsible, reliable persons with integrity. The market-enabling ethic of a morality of recognition, noticed by Durkheim, is also proven by Max Weber to be a historical reality. In his essay on Protestant sects in the USA, this German sociologist wanted to show that membership in certain sects is what enabled business relationships with strangers in the first place. Membership in the same religious group enabled the parties to the contract to feel certain that the other would be committed to the same rules as oneself. This insight on the part of classical economic sociology, according to which an antecedent morality of recognition prevents markets' failure, has been taken up indirectly by institutional economics, which can be understood as a counter-tendency to dominant neoclassical economics. These new alternative approaches demonstrate that institutional pre-market security mechanisms are needed to counter the malicious behavior of market actors. Institutional economics thus essentially aims to prove that the establishment of such morally binding institutions cannot be explained on the basis of the dominant economic theory's own presuppositions. If all actors strictly viewed themselves as individual utility maximizers, then we could not explain their willingness to share the costs of institutionalizing constraints which are ultimately beneficial to all. Even in these alternative economic approaches, the findings amount to the same claim made by Durkheim and Weber, which is that the functioning of market relationships is contingent upon a morality of recognition that cannot be explained in utilitarian terms. Without an antecedent agreement among the actors to not treat each other merely as egocentric utility maximizers, but also as credible contract partners, market activities would constantly be threatened by deceitfulness and distrust. Hegel offers what is probably the strongest account of the ethical preconditions of the market. He believed that participants in exchange processes on the market must always already view each other as members of an ethical community if they truly want to grasp the market as a common institution for increasing the well-being and the freedom of all. But such daring considerations are not needed to support the thesis that the market always depends on an ethics that precedes and enables it. So I come to the second point, namely an ethics that accompanies the market. Following Jens Beckert, an ethics that accompanies the market can be understood as encompassing all the moral conceptions which influence the individual preferences of market actors, moving them to apply ethical standards to their economic behavior. The great degree to which both purchase and investment decisions on the market are influenced by such normative criteria has been pointed out most clearly by the recently deceased American economic sociologist Albert Hirschman. His comprehensive studies have inspired a great deal of research on the question of how and to what extent moral beliefs have influenced and continue to influence market transactions. With regard to purchase decisions, that is, everyday consumption, the significance of value-based preferences is neither surprising nor does it contradict the theoretical premises of the dominant economic theory. After all, the latter, the dominant economic theory, assumes the arbitrariness of individual preferences, claiming only that actors seek to maximize the satisfaction of their preferences, thus allowing a space for even normative or considered consumer decisions. Nevertheless, it is always astonishing to see the degree to which even in the 19th and 20th century entire branches of production came to a halt once consumers had become ethically committed to abstaining from certain products. For instance, in certain social classes, spending a great deal of money on alcoholic beverages was long considered to be a vice. In the wake of the first wave of women's liberation movement, spending on lingerie was looked down upon due to the objectification of the female body. Finally, after the oil crisis, expensive guzzling automobiles were viewed as ethically problematic. And they disappeared, by the way, from at least the German streets. Yeah? For a long time, at least 10 years, you couldn't see all these heavy automobiles which you see now all over. And they disappeared because of decisions by the consumers. I mean, morally based decisions by the consumers. Just because we now here talk of the moralization of consumer markets as consumers increasingly apply moral or ecological standards to their purchases, this does not mean that this is an historically novel phenomenon. Consumers on capitalistic commodity markets have always been influenced by moral conceptions which steer their individual preferences towards products that are reconcilable with their own ethical standards. Although, as I said, this might be reconcilable with the economic paradigm of the utility maximizing individual, the validity of moral standards when it comes to investment decisions poses much greater problems for neoclassical economics. After all, this theory's underlying premises should entail that the competition mechanism of the market requires the pursuit of purely monetary, economically calculable aims. Yet the fact that this has not always been the case in the past, that investors have always let themselves be influenced by ethical considerations, can be taken as an indication of the problematic boundary between classical economic sociology and neoclassical economics. In terms of both consumer behavior and the production of goods, we must account for the fact that individual preferences are influenced by ethical considerations and thus transcend the narrow horizon of purely monetary calculations. To take a recent example, so-called Islamic and social investments play an ever greater role on financial markets. The ethical criterion at work in the first type of investment decision demands that financial investments be compatible with Islam's ban on interest. In the second type, financial investments are directed towards companies that either place special value on the environmental friendliness of their products, pursue developmental aims, or refrain from the production of certain goods, such as weapons. In Max Weber's economic sociology, there is a further set of examples which prove that even in the 19th century, moral criteria were applied to investment decisions in both industry and finance. However, this only means that the behavior of market actors can be significantly influenced by ethical considerations, but not that such moral orientations are necessary for the successful functioning of exchange processes on the market. Therefore, there is a grave discrepancy between the types of ethics that enable the market and those that accompany the market. The former must be viewed as indispensable to the functioning of the market, the latter only as possible occurrences on the market or as an accompaniment to the market. These might accommodate the normative promises of the market, but are not necessary in order for it to function. An entirely different matter is the third form of normative orientations, those that have been described as restricting the market. These type of ethics germane to the market places a stronger emphasis on the morality of recognition, which was only of secondary importance in the ethics that accompanies the market, since in this case, moral considerations can stem from all kinds of different sources. Moreover, here we encounter a further indispensable ethical requirement of the market. So I come to the last point, ethics that restrict the market. Here we are dealing with moral conceptions that work to restrict or abolish the rules of the market. Such ethical restrictions can arise as a result of either public objections or measures taken by the state. A number of examples for the first alternative can be found in the works of economic historians and will only be cited here to the extent that it is necessary to prove that the respective kind of foundational ethics is linked to ideas about morally necessary relations of recognition between individual persons. It is well known, and as Jens Beckert shows, that in 19th century America, the population generally refused to purchase life insurance because they regarded it as morally repugnant to benefit from the death of close relatives or friends. It was not until ethical ideas about the relations of recognition between relatives had changed, with economic precautions for the following generations coming to seem morally obligatory, that there arose a growing demand for life insurance. A similar example is the refusal of large parts of the working class in early industrialization to work longer than was deemed necessary to maintain what was taken to be an adequate standard of living. The famous investigations of the historian E.P. Thompson. An economically efficient labor market could thus not arise as long as these traditional reservations had not been abandoned and replaced by the ethical belief that one should ensure a higher standard of living for one's own family in the future. Yet, traditional reservations are not the only ideas that can lead via collective attitudes to the restriction of markets. The modern-day principle of achievement, which also represents a certain notion about the recognition people owe each other, can also motivate resistance to practices of commodification, such as when criticism of speculative profits from real estate investments or the activities of private equity funds spreads. This could lead so far as to seriously consider to forbid by law any kind of financial speculation not aimed at productive outcomes and entailing the risk of destroying the living conditions of vast groups of the population. Although we can regard these cases as examples of how individual moral beliefs in the form of collective reservations can bring about the ethical restriction or at least the problematization of markets, the ethically justified restriction of the market via certain institutions plays a much greater historical role. The best example for this second type of market-restricting ethics is the gradual implementation of safety precautions and social insurance via the welfare state in most Western European countries since the end of the 19th century. It would be wrong to view this gradual expansion of social rights merely as a result of the state's adjustment to the functional requirements of the economic system. Rather, this is the expression, mediated by social struggles, of a moral condition or moral precondition that seems to inhabit the functional requirements of the market itself. A market presupposes the morality of a recognition I have already elucidated with respect to the non-contractual preconditions of contracts and the ethics that enable the market, but that is not all. True, it is necessary that contractual partners must recognize each other antecedently as responsible and morally reliable persons in order for them to be assured that the other will respect the terms of the contract. However, it is just as important and certainly just as indispensable that both sides have sufficient economic independence, viability, and orientation in order to be able to accept or reject contractual offers freely. Participation in the market, the entire idea of which demands that this be done out of individual freedom and for the purpose of realizing that freedom, not only presupposes mutual recognition of moral integrity, but also that we recognize each other as free economic citizens and accord each other the corresponding material and cultural necessities. I propose that it is this normative precondition of the market system that was at least partially achieved in the welfare state measures welfare state measures which restrict the activities on the market. Yet, contrary to what is often claimed, this does not represent the application of social or political values to a market to which these values are foreign. Rather, this amounts to the assertion of the moral preconditions inherent and crucial to the functioning of the market itself. For these represent the initial conditions for the freedom of all involved as economic citizens. The market-restricting ethics embodied in a very rudimentary fashion by the welfare state is just as little an externally imposed restriction as the ethics that enables the market. Instead, it is an inherent element of a rational market system. Paradoxically, in order for a market to function properly, that is, in order for it to function in accordance with its own principles, a variety of morally justified market restrictions are required, by means of which all participants become capable of acting as free economic citizens. Contrary to the ideas raised today by political philosophers such as Deborah Satz or Michael Sandel, a moral restriction of the market is not needed because this is the only way to ensure the citoyen's political freedom. Rather, it is indispensable because if we do not eliminate or curtail a one-sided pursuit of profit that pays no heed to the common good, then the required conditions for market participants' capacity to make use of the freedoms the market promises will not be given. The dominant economic theory, which is one-sided focus on the individual pursuit of self-interest, cannot get sight of these internal ethics of the market. Instead, it presupposes competent, autonomous, well-informed utility maximizers, as if this character was a gift given by society or God, without considering whether the market itself is to be made responsible for creating the conditions of its own existence. Only the kind of moral economism I have mentioned in connection with Hegel, Durkheim, and Albert Hirschman gives us an adequate sense of the many kinds of ethics and the many precarious relations of recognition upon which the market relies in order to live up to its own principles. What we can learn from this tradition is that the market requires moral restrictions for the sake of its own functioning. In short, the market is much more morally demanding than its official theorists make us to believe. I come to the second and concluding remarks now. It is precisely at this point, with the market restricting ethics of the market, that the tradition of moral economism comes into contact with the third interpretation of the market I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. In the tradition of early socialists and Marx, a growing theoretical current claims today that the market system is structurally incapable of realizing the very same ethics that the representatives of the second interpretation of the market regard as the latter's inherent conditions of existence. Two objections in particular are meant to show that a general increase in well-being and freedom necessitates overcoming this economic system. First, it is claimed that in the market economy, the wage-dependent cannot enjoy the promised contractual freedom because they depend completely on performing wage labor to survive, and thus cannot turn down any labor contract regardless of the working conditions or pay their employees offer. Because they are essentially compelled to take on any work for any pay, these producers do not have enjoy of the freedoms that market society promises to all its members. They thus suffer from what Gerald Cohen, a famous political philosopher, Marxist political philosopher, has called proletarian unfreedom. A philosopher, as I mentioned, in the tradition of analytical Marxism. Second, this tradition claims that exploitation is a necessary part of the market economy, which consists in the fact that the owners of the means of production always extract an unearned profit from those who must sell their labor power because the produced commodities contain a quantity of value that exceeds the wages needed to reproduce the labor power of the workers. The difference between these two quantities, the quantity which constitutes exploitation, is therefore claimed to derive from the fact that the productivity of labor, that is, the value it creates, is necessarily higher than the costs needed to preserve the commodity of labor power. Real unfreedom and structural exploitation thus remain the two major objections raised by the third interpretation of the market to the latter's legitimacy. I believe it can be shown that both objections can be picked up and addressed by the tradition of moral economism without abandoning the market framework as such. This, however, will require that we reformulate these 2 points of criticism, regarding them not as structural necessities, but as empirical facts about the current state of the capitalist market economy. This will make apparent how these problems can be gradually resolved in the name of the normative principles of the market. To conclude, I only want to give a brief indication of the solution I propose in order to show how fruitful it is to understand the market as a morally demanding institution. The second objection, according to which the exploitation of productive labor is a necessary element of the capitalist market, is controversial among Marxists today. I think the first objections, one of the first objections, a long debate starting at around 1900. The objections after Second World were first raised against this, the assumptions of Marx's theory of labor were raised by Joan Robinson, to my knowledge, which who had written texts which were available or accessible even to me as a philosopher. Not only are the premises of such a labor theory of value considered highly questionable, since it is not clear how we derive the criteria for such a judgment, it is also a mystery why the labor performed in services, management, and science should play no role in economic value creation. In light of such doubts, the claim that labor in capitalist firms necessarily implies exploitation becomes, in my view, more an empirical claim, the truth of which depends on whether and how the portion of the company's non-reinvested returns are distributed to the workers. In the tradition of moral economism, we could say that market-based relations of recognition between free economic citizens imply that all contributions be remunerated according to a fair, well-considered application of the principle of accomplishment or merit. The same is true of the first objection, according to which the capitalist market system prevents the majority of the population from making use of their contractual freedoms. Here as well, categorical and empirical claims are intertwined in a knot that is not easy to disentangle. Certainly it is true, and this is also conceded by Durkheim, that in cases of economic dependency, many market participants are incapable of deciding freely whether to accept or reject contracts. Moral economism, however, can view this problem as a case of market failure, one which necessitates reforms that restrict the working of the market and help to eliminate power inequalities between market participants, even including the abolition of classical inheritance law, a measure envisioned by Durkheim as far back as the early 20th century. Durkheim was convinced that the right of inheritance brings about an extremely unequal distribution at the beginning of each individual's life path, thus robbing the disadvantaged of the chance to exercise their contractual freedom. Which of these two alternatives we chose, whether we search for the solution to the problem of real unfreedom outside of the market system or within its institutional framework, ultimately depends on the amount of ethics we are willing to accord to the market as its own inherent condition of existence. In the tradition of moral economism, the market is neither an autopoietic system that follows its own laws, as Luhmann or even Marx occasionally claim, nor, as Habermas believes, a sphere of norm-free sociality, in which there is only room for strategic considerations. Instead, the market, in its respective historical form, be it for good or for bad, it is the institutional outcome of normative regulations that can always be traced back to the struggles of social actors over the shape of the economy. If we take a look at the current public debate, then it seems that the second normative interpretation hardly plays any role anymore, whereas the first and the third interpretation of the market enjoy very vocal support. The first interpretation can be found in the established economic theory and among the political elite, while the third interpretation can be found in various anti-capitalist movements and among the proponents of a newly, relatively primitive Marxism. But given the fact that when it comes to coordinating complex economic processes, there no longer seems to be any alternative to the market, since all experiments with alternative forms of economic coordination have failed. I believe, therefore, the time has come to recall this forgotten tradition of moral economism. This theory argues that as citizens, we are all called upon to struggle for the market restrictions we feel unnecessary to adopt it to the requirements of our democratic coexistence. And if sometimes in a vague future we should find out by experiments and practical experiences that this purpose is best served by an economic system which could be called market socialism, it will be our moral task to do everything at our disposal to try to realize it. Thank you very much.